Picture this. You walk into a gym. There's no air conditioning, no machines, no headphones, and absolutely no clothes. Instead of lifting weights, you're covered in olive oil, discussing philosophy with a sweaty man named Demetrius who hasn't discovered deodorant. Welcome to the ancient Greek gymnasium, a place where nudity was mandatory, awkwardness was weaponized, and yes, the floors were freezing. This wasn't just exercise, it was a soapless, slippery social experiment. And if you think this is where it gets weird, buckle up, because history, it's less boring dates and dusty scrolls, and more topless wrestling and existential crises, still here. You might as well stretch that thumb and hit like or subscribe if you're into oiled philosophers and cold hard truths. This is boring history for sleep, the anti-boring kind. Imagine peeling off your toga, or what's left of it, and stepping barefoot onto a dusty stone courtyard. The air smells like sweat, stale olives, and something vaguely philosophical. Welcome to the gymnasium of ancient Greece, where men gathered not only to build biceps, but to debate Plato's latest hot take, all while fully nude. Because, you see, the Greeks didn't invent the gym. They perfected the art of being unnecessarily naked in one dot. Now, let's get one thing out of the way. Gymnos, the root of the word gymnasium, doesn't mean place of abs or temple of glutes. It means naked. Straight up, no metaphors. The ancient Greek gym was where men stripped down to their nothings, rubbed themselves in oil like sensual chicken wings, and got to work on their physiques. It was a full body flex, both literal and cultural, and this wasn't some fringe kink of a few eccentric philosophers. The gymnasium was the institution, the ancient prototype for what we now call everything from fitness centers to schools. It was where the Greek ideals of beauty, intellect, and sheer audacity were sculpted. In the open air, picture a mix between a sports training facility, TED Talk stage, and mildly uncomfortable bachelor party. Add marble columns and judgmental pigeons, and you're there. So why all the nudity? Well, in a culture obsessed with symmetry, perfection, and the gods who were all, inconveniently, naked and shredded clothing was just a barrier between your mortal self and your aspirational statue form. To the Greeks, the unclothed male body was the height of aesthetic and moral excellence. A good body reflected a good soul, or so they claimed, usually while flexing. But let's not pretend it was all poetic and high-minded. Beneath the sun surface of these bronzed bodies was a power game of absurd proportions. Nudity in the gym wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a social filter. Who you were, how you stood, even how you sweated, it all sent signals. This was Instagram, without the filters, where status updates came in the form of flexed calves and philosophical side eyes. See, not everyone got in. The gymnasium was for male citizens only, not slaves, not foreigners, and definitely not women, unless you were a goddess, in which case you were probably carved into a pedestal and still somehow excluded. The gym was a highly curated space, a literal arena of privilege where elite men honed their bodies and minds in sync, or, at least, pretended to, while sneakily trying to outdo each other in push-up form and moral superiority. Of course, this obsession with bodily perfection didn't come without its oddities. For example, men were expected to train nude, but remain modest. No leering, no flaunting, just pure, stoic exposure. The contradiction here is almost comical. You're standing next to your political rival, both glistening in the sun like meat in a deli case, but you're supposed to keep a straight face and recite Homer. Go ahead, Try that at your local LA Fitness, and don't be fooled into thinking this was just a sweaty playground. The gymnasium was as intellectual as it was physical. Philosophers roamed like shirtless guidance counselors, ready to ambush you mid-squat with a question like, "But what is virtue really?" Picture Socrates, in your spin class, asking if your triceps are truly free or merely conditioned by society's expectations of strength. No escape, no earbuds, just unfiltered enlightenment. But there's a darker undercurrent here. This culture of constant observation of bodies on display had its consequences. Young men were judged not only on their athletic prowess, but their looks, posture, and yes, even how they applied their oil. It was a constant performance. To be seen was to be evaluated. And in a society that equated beauty with morality, one misplaced belly roll could be a philosophical crisis. Let that sink in for a second. Imagine if every visit to the gym came with an open critique of your moral fiber, based on how well your pecs held up in sunlight. And still they came. Day after day, the courtyard buzzed with debate, rivalry, and the occasional soft grunting of wrestling matches gone a little too long. The gym was more than a place to train. It was a crucible where the ideal citizen was forged naked, glistening, and terrifyingly aware of everyone else's opinions. It wasn't just about strength, it was about character, or at least the kind of character that looked good while doing push-ups in sandals. The Greeks didn't separate mind and body. They believed you honed both in the same sweaty, dusty, cold-as-hell place. And the gymnasium, despite its name, wasn't exactly a spa. It was open-air, seasonally insensitive, and filled with sandbugs. And the gentle humiliation of slipping on your own olive oil mid-lunge. Yet, for all its flaws, the gymnasium captured something deeply human, the desire to transform, to be seen not just in strength, but in aspiration, to become a version of yourself that's both admired and improved, even if it means doing it naked in front of strangers. And that's the twist. For all its awkwardness and absurd rituals, the ancient Greek gym was a sacred space, not because of the gods that watched over it, but because of the raw, vulnerable pursuit that happened inside it. It was awkward. It was performative. It was deeply human. So what happens when fitness isn't just about the body, but about philosophy, reputation, and silent judgment? What happens when the gym becomes a battlefield for ideals, egos, and olive oil? Let's just say things are about to get slipperier. If there's one thing the ancient Greeks did better than modern influencers, it was moisturizing. And not just your average post-shower dab of lotion. We're talking full-body olive oil coverage, like a turkey before roasting. Except this turkey is expected to wrestle, sprint, and maybe discuss metaphysics before lunch. Yes, before any workout began, the ritual was the same. Strip, slather, scrape. Naked men, mostly young, mostly gleaming, would coat themselves in layers of olive oil, carefully applied by hand or for the wealthier athletes. By a loyal peditribe, think personal trainer meets masseuse, meets unlicensed philosopher. It was equal parts athletic preparation and sacred performance. But why olive oil? Did they fear ashy elbows? Not quite. The oil was thought to warm the muscles, improve circulation, and this is important, give the skin a healthy glow. After all, when your body is your resume, every glisten counts. A matte finish was a social death sentence. Now, after all that oiling up, you couldn't just run around slick like a greased eel. That would be dangerous. So after exercising, Men used a curved metal tool called a strigil. Imagine a minimalist butter knife with identity issues to scrape the oil, sweat, and dirt off their bodies in one go. It was oddly satisfying and probably smelled like a salad with regret. The oily goop collected was known as gloios, and, in a twist that proves the Greeks were both ingenious and mildly horrifying, it was sometimes bottled and sold as a medicinal salve. That's right, athlete sludge. Rub it on your joints. Just try not to think about where it came from. Let that sink in, literally now. While all this oiling and scraping may sound absurdly sensual by today's standards, it had a solemn, almost sacred undertone for the Greeks. Preparing your body for training wasn't just hygiene, it was reverence, a respect for the physical form as a divine instrument. They believed the human body, especially a well-groomed, oiled one, mirrored the gods themselves. And if Zeus had abs, well, so should you. Enter Socrates. Yes, the man we associate with reason, logic, and the unfortunate habit of being executed for asking too many questions. Socrates was a frequent visitor to the gymnasiums of Athens, not because he loved burpees, but because where better to challenge young men's minds than while they were covered in oil and panting. Imagine mid-lunge, and here comes this bearded barefoot man, eyes twinkling with mischief and madness, asking, "Tell me, what is justice?" The gym was his lecture hall and his students, a captive audience of shirtless brothers, cornered by their own curiosity and lack of exit strategy. He believed in harmonizing body and soul, that physical excellence must be matched with intellectual depth. To Socrates, a man who only trained his body was as incomplete as a philosopher who skipped leg day. And he made this point often, usually while dodging flying discus and unsolicited flexes, and he wasn't alone. The overlap between gym culture and philosophy in ancient Greece was so strong. It's a wonder modern gyms don't offer weekly Aristotle seminars between spin classes. The famous school of Plato, the Academy, was literally next to a gymnasium. Coincidence? Probably. Not. Plato himself was a wrestler in his youth, and his nickname, Platon, came from his broad shoulders. So yes, the man who wrote about the immortal soul also had killer traps. To the Greeks, wisdom didn't float disembodied in the ether. It sweated, it stumbled, it slipped on its own strigil once or twice. But with all this intellect sloshing around the locker room, things occasionally got complicated. Because here's the uncomfortable part. The line between admiration and objectification in Greek gyms was thinner than a philosopher's patience. Young men, ephebs, were at the center of this dynamic, admired not only for their budding physical form, but their potential minds. And where there's admiration, especially in a culture that saw male relationships as pedagogical and occasionally romantic, well, let's just say things got awkward. This led to a constant, quiet tension. Was that elder staring because he saw promise in your dialectics, or because your quadriceps caught the sunlight just right? The oil didn't help. Nothing glistens innocently after a certain point. And yet, in the middle of all this confusion, the scraping, the sweating, the sudden philosophical quizzes, the gymnasium remained a cornerstone of Greek culture, because it wasn't about the oil. Not really. It was about the body as a starting point for something more. A mirror that could either reflect vanity or discipline, temptation or transcendence. Still, you can't help but wonder, were the Greeks truly exercising? Or exercising? Purging their doubts and desires through rituals that felt both holy and absurd. Let's take a breath here. Imagine standing on warm stone, the sun low in the sky, A light breeze cutting across your skin, still slick with oil. The chatter of dialectic debates floats through the air, mixed with the grunts of exertion and the occasional clatter of a dropped discus. It's chaotic, it's poetic, it's oddly peaceful for the Greeks. This was the harmony of the body and soul, a place where you could wrestle both your opponent and your own arrogance. And that oil, that ridiculous, slippery ritual. Maybe it was never about appearances. Maybe it was a symbol of preparation, of purification, of the impossible hope that one day perfection could be grasped, even if only for a moment, before being scraped off and sold in a jar. So what were they really working on out there in the courtyard? Their muscles or their meaning? The truth is, they never separated the two, and maybe neither should we. Let's kill a popular fantasy before it stretches too far. Ancient Greece was not an endless beach, scene lit by golden hour sunlight, with oiled men lounging under fig trees, trading clever one-liners between reps. No, sometimes it was cold, not metaphorically cold, literally. Bone-rattling, nipple-stiffening cold. And the gymnasiums, they were outside. That's right, open air. No roof, no heating. No heated mats, no peppermint-scented towels, no soothing post-workout playlists. Just wind, stone, and the lingering scent of last week's dried sweat baking. In the sun, or freezing in the shadows. The floors, usually stone or packed dirt, were brutal on the body, especially bare feet, especially in winter. Imagine stepping onto a slab of marble at dawn, barefoot, while trying not to show weakness in front of a rival who once stole your poetry scroll. That's not fitness. That's a Greek tragedy. And still they showed up. Why? Ego, discipline, a crippling fear of appearing soft in a society where comfort was basically code for cowardice. Probably all three. The gymnasium wasn't about physical health in the modern sense. It was a stage. And like any good stage, it came with an audience. Training nude under the open sky, with no protection from the elements or from each other's judgment, was a kind of social crucible. You were constantly being watched, and not in a gentle, encouraging, you got this, Alexio sort of way. More like, let's silently evaluate your calf symmetry and deduct moral points if you slip. And that slipping part, it happened. The combination of oil, cold, stone, and pride was not a safe one. Yet no one laughed, not openly. Open mockery was too pedestrian. The Greeks preferred cold glances, the kind of look that says, you fell during warm-ups. I hope you fall in battle, too. It was psychological warfare, with sandals. You see, ancient Greek gym culture was built on quiet intimidation. You didn't brag, you displayed. You didn't shout. You grunted strategically. Confidence was shown in your posture, your physique. Your lack of visible goosebumps, despite the frost biting at your thighs, and the colder it got, the more stoic you were expected to be. Shivering was not ideal. Rubbing your arms for warmth, absolutely not. The correct response to physical discomfort was to pretend your soul had transcended it. Think Jedi, but naked and annoyed. Let's pause here. Imagine this, it's early morning. The city of Athens is just beginning to stir. You arrive at the palestra, breath puffing in the chill air, your skin covered in goose flesh. The marble underfoot is icy enough to make your ankles consider early retirement. And there, across the courtyard, stands a man twice your age, with a beard thicker than your will to live, silently stretching in the cold like it's a casual spring day. You want to turn back. You want to hide behind a column. Instead, you step into the cold, because that's the game. Endure and be seen doing it. Not enduring is invisible. Only pain, when displayed just right, earns respect. And yes, there were warm seasons. But cold seasons revealed who you really were. Modern gyms have mirrors. Ancient gymnasiums had peers, and they remembered everything. Who cried after tripping in the sandpit? Who looked too long at another man's quadriceps? Who warmed their hands discreetly behind a statue of Hermes? It was a collective memory bank of shame. And winter workouts were where your legacy was forged or frozen. But beyond the social politics, there's something strangely admirable about it. This shared ritual of discomfort, this unspoken agreement that self-improvement meant braving the elements, not just the physical ones, but emotional too. Because cold air wasn't just cold air, it was judgment, exposure, vulnerability, stripped down to its most literal. It wasn't just your body that was laid bare. It was your insecurities, your discipline, your limits. And that's the part we don't see on museum plaques. Ancient Greek culture glorified control, control of the body, control of emotion, control of reputation. To train in the cold, while naked, was a kind of silent sermon. Look what I can endure, your body said. Look how little I need. The pain wasn't incidental, it was the point. It forged a toughness they believed would translate into every other sphere, battle, politics, even philosophy. Because if you could handle slipping on cold marble while trying to perfect your discus throw, you could probably handle an argument with Socrates, or at least not burst into tears halfway through. Still, we have to wonder, were they training or performing? Did the pain elevate them, or just harden them? Did cold create character, or just crush the parts that didn't fit the mold? There's no easy answer, but we know this: no one made excuses. If you didn't show up to train, you didn't get stronger. If you showed up and flinched, you might as well not have come. The cold wasn't an obstacle, it was the filter, and through that filter, only the most disciplined or the most stubborn remained. Let that settle for a second. Picture the quiet, the stillness, a line of bare footprints on a frosted courtyard. The sun not yet fully risen. Men stretching, silently, steam curling from their breath. Their skin trembling not from weakness, but from the sheer absurd strength it took to pretend it didn't dot. So yeah, breathe that in, dust and all. This was the birthplace of Stoicism, not in a scroll, not in a symposium, but in a place where you wrestled not only each other, but the cold, the judgment, yourself and tomorrow. They'd do it again. Let's begin with a simple truth. Wrestling in ancient Greece was not, strictly speaking, safe for work. Imagine two grown men, stripped completely naked, bodies glistening with olive oil, engaging in full contact, grappling in public, for honor, or maybe just because it was Thursday. The Greeks called it pale, a form of wrestling that was 1 part sport, 1 part martial training, and at least 3 parts public performance. It wasn't just about strength. It was about control, about technique, about humiliating your opponent while looking like a demigod doing it. There were no padded mats, no weight classes, and no shorts to hike up awkwardly. Just skin, dust, and the occasional existential crisis. The objective: get your opponent to touch the ground, shoulder, hip, or back, 3 times. Easy enough, right? Except this wasn't WWE. There were no folding chairs, no referees with whistles. Just judges watching silently and the echo of flesh slapping earth broken occasionally by grunts, cheers, and the philosophical musings of a nearby spectator wondering if all conflict is in fact internal. Now, if you're picturing something vaguely erotic, well, you're not wrong. And the Greeks knew it. They just didn't flinch. Because for them, the line between admiration and arousal was blurry, if not intentionally smudged. Wrestling wasn't about modesty. It was about dominance, psychological and physical. Victory was a public declaration of power. Defeat, a lesson in humility, to be taken home with a limp and a revised worldview. But here's the twist. They saw this as education. Agon, the Greek word for contest, wasn't just sport. It was a noble struggle, a proving ground of character. And in a culture where boys became men through competition, wrestling was the ultimate syllabus. There were no pens, just pinning. And boy, were there pins. Sweeps, throws, locks. Every move was designed to bend, twist, or force your opponent into the ground without mercy. Yet, oddly enough, there was a code of honor. Biting, illegal. Eye gouging, frowned upon. Smack, likely replaced with a quote from Homer. Still, no amount of poetry could mask how awkward it could get. Because oil, remember, that slippery little tradition, turned every match into a high-stakes slip and slide of human ambition. Limbs tangled, faces planted, pride got carpet burned on stone courtyards, and once in a while, someone's elbow landed somewhere it very much wasn't meant to. That wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. Let that image linger. Two nude athletes, locked in a sweaty knot, both pretending that nothing unusual is happening, just good old-fashioned paideia, the noble training of young minds and bodies. Meanwhile, the onlookers sip watered-down wine, nod sagely, and pretend they're watching a Socratic debate in motion. But the awkwardness was part of the lesson. Wrestling stripped you of your dignity as much as your clothing. It taught resilience, grace under pressure, and how to pretend that landing face first in sand while half your village watches is, in fact, a noble pursuit. And speaking of watchers, let's talk about the audience. The palestra, or wrestling school, was rarely empty. Philosophers, poets, politicians, they all came to observe. Some came for the sport, others less so. In a world where mentorship could blur with admiration and admiration could lean into attraction, the gymnasium was more than a training ground. It was a stage of unspoken desires, relationships often formed between older men and younger athletes, the cultural norm known as pederasty. It was to the Greeks educational, to us deeply uncomfortable. Still, it happened, and it added a complicated layer to wrestling. The struggle on the floor sometimes mirrored a different kind of power dynamic playing out off it. Was it mentorship or manipulation? Was the grip a move or a message? No easy answers, just tension, emotional, cultural, physical, and while all of this unfolded, the sweat, the strain, the questionable glances, there was an even greater purpose behind the chaos. Preparing for war, because Pale wasn't just for sport. It was battlefield training. You learned how to move your body, anticipate your opponent, and remain calm while someone tried to drive your shoulder into the dirt. That's not just sport, that's survival. And for a city-state constantly at war, knowing how to fall, and more importantly, how to get up, was essential. Let's pause here. Picture the moment of a match. Two men circling each other, muscles tense, breath sharp in the still morning air. They lunge, dust flies, bodies collide. And for a second, it's unclear where one ends and the other begins. not in some romantic sense, but in sheer, exhausting, sweaty determination. The fight becomes singular, purposeful, pure, and then it ends. One man stands. One lies on his back, eyes blinking at the sky, ego bruised but spirit intact. They part with a nod, not of affection, but of mutual recognition. You were strong, I was stronger. Next time, maybe you will be. And maybe that's the core of it. Wrestling, in its strange, naked chaos, was about truth. There were no illusions, no costumes, no scripts, just you, your opponent, and the dirt. And if that truth was messy, sweaty, and borderline indecent, well, so was life. Modern gyms, for all their protein bars and climate control, don't offer that kind of honesty. We train with earbuds in, mirrors on every wall, pretending we're alone while desperately hoping someone's watching. But the Greeks, they knew they were being watched and leaned into it, not with vanity, but with vulnerability. So the next time you see an ancient statue, chiseled and serene, think of the moment before that, the fall, the grunt, the awkward entanglement. Because perfection wasn't the point, struggle was. And in the dirt of the wrestling yard, with all the ego scraped raw and the olive oil staining the ground, that's where the real transformation began. Let's set the scene again. Sun-bleached marble, naked bodies glistening in olive oil, debates echoing through columns, and the air thick with testosterone and probably some unresolved mother issues. But amid all the dust and discipline, there's one glaring absence: women. Because if you were a female in ancient Greece, your chances of joining the local gym were about as good as being voted most likely to command the Athenian navy. Translation: 0. The gymnasium, both in practice and in philosophy, was for men, specifically freeborn Greek males. Women, slaves, foreigners, and anyone whose facial hair hadn't reached minimum philosophical density. Banned. The gym was less a public facility and more an exclusive club, complete with a strict no. Girls allowed policy carved not on a sign, but into the social fabric of the polis itself. Why? Because the gym wasn't just about fitness. It was about arete, virtue, excellence, manhood. The Greeks saw physical training as a pathway to moral and civic development, and according to the prevailing wisdom of the time, women didn't need that. Their virtue was tied to modesty, silence, and the ability to not be seen, especially not while naked and doing lunges in the courtyard. And so, while men greased each other up and discussed metaphysics mid-squat, women were expected to stay home, spinning wool and trying not to exist too loudly. But, and this is a thick, glorious but, there were exceptions, because, as history loves to remind us, humans are great at creating rules, and even better at breaking them. Let's head to Sparta. Sparta was the ancient Greek version of that one friend who takes fitness too seriously. Here, women weren't just allowed to train, they were expected to. Spartan girls ran, wrestled, and threw javelins in public, in tunics shorter than their patience for weak men. And while they didn't train nude like the boys, a boundary even Sparta wasn't ready to cross. They came alarmingly close. This wasn't out of feminist enlightenment. Mind you, Spartan women were trained to produce strong sons. Their physical fitness was national policy, not personal freedom. But within that narrow mandate, they found a rare kind of power, unlike their Athenian counterparts, who were basically ornamental. Furniture with blood pressure, Spartan women had agency, presence, and sometimes medals enter. Kyniska, Kyniska, was a Spartan princess with a name that literally means puppy, which is ironic considering she utterly dominated one of the most male-drenched institutions of her time, the Olympics. Now, before we get carried away, she didn't compete directly. That was still illegal for women. But she found a loophole. Equestrian events, chariot races, awarded victory to the horse owner, not the rider. So Kyniska bred a team of championship horses, entered them in the games, and when they won, she got the crown, twice. Her statue was erected at Olympia, and the inscription made it very clear, I, a woman, won this. Mic drop in Doric. Kyniska's story is a rebellious whisper inside a society screaming no girls allowed. She didn't kick down the doors of the gymnasium. She walked around them with a chariot and made the whole system look silly. But what about Athenian women? The ones left behind? Well, some resisted invisibility in quieter ways. In rare cases, noble women funded athletic events or trained privately at home, shielded from public view. Some even attended competitions in disguise, risking shame, scandal, or worse. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, definitely dramatic, of a woman named Cleopatra who snuck into the Olympics dressed as a male trainer to see her son compete. When he won, she leapt over a barrier in celebration and surprise. Her disguise came undone, gasps, drama. But instead of punishment, the judges spared her. Why? Because she was from a famous athletic family, and apparently, nepotism outranked misogyny that day. Still, the message remained clear. Your place is not here, and that exclusion wasn't just physical, it was philosophical. The same thinkers who praised symmetry, virtue, and the ideal male form also wrote long, condescending treatises about how women were basically malformed men, less rational, more emotional, biologically inconvenient. Aristotle, humanity's smartest mansplainer, believed women were colder and thus inferior. Ironic, considering how cold those gym floors were. So what does strength mean in a world that refuses to see yours? To train, to compete, to simply be in defiance of rules that say your body isn't noble enough, your mind not sharp enough, your presence not allowed. It's resistance. Quiet, powerful resistance. And here's where the story twists again. Because even though women were barred from the gymnasium, they were often the subject of art inside it. Murals, sculptures, poetry, all celebrating female beauty, usually imagined by men who hadn't spoken to a woman in weeks. It's a strange paradox. The very culture that denied women access to the space still used their forms to decorate it. Like hanging a picture of someone you refuse to let in the house. But if you squint, if you look closely between the lines of history, you see something else, a persistent echo of women training in secret, competing in loopholes, carving out slivers of freedom in a world that tried to render them invisible. Let's take a breath here. Close your eyes. Picture the gym courtyard buzzing with bodies, voices, motion. Then, just beyond its walls, a smaller courtyard. A woman stretches in the morning light, alone, unseen, but no less determined. She runs, she trains, not for glory, not for the gods, but for herself. Because strength, denied, does not vanish. It finds another path. So yes, the gymnasium banned women, but it never erased them. And what does that say about us? That sometimes the greatest power isn't breaking through the front door. It's building your own arena just outside the walled now that we've oiled ourselves into philosophical confusion and wrestled half-naked under the Athenian sunrise. It's time to ask a very normal, completely non-blasphemous question. Did the ancient Greeks work out for the gods? Short answer, yes. Long answer, oh yes. And they were dramatic about it. You see, the gymnasium wasn't just a place for lunges, grunting, and awkward eye contact. It was sacred ground, literally. Most gymnasia were built near or directly attached to temples and shrines. You might be mid-stride in a javelin run and glance over to see an altar dedicated to Hermes, god of athletics, travel, and naturally, eloquently sweaty men. Because, in Greece, physical training wasn't just for health. It was a spiritual offering. Imagine doing bicep curls in the shadow of a statue of Apollo, hoping that your vein-popping effort was pleasing to him, and also that no one noticed you skipped leg day. That's what it was like. You trained for glory, yes, but also for piety. This wasn't just body worship, it was divine cosplay. The ancient Greeks believed the gods had gifted humanity with a spark of perfection, and it was your job to chisel yourself into something worthy of that gift. Hence, a ripped torso was basically an act of religious devotion, and if your abs could make a priest weep, even better. So it wasn't unusual to start your workout with a little prayer, a sacrifice of incense, or even a miniature offering. Say, a wreath or a lock of hair, to ask the gods for strength, speed, or at the very least, not to tear a hamstring. Because yes, even the divine appreciated good form. Take Heracles, the original Greek fitness influencer. Half god, all muscle, definitely not skipping core day. He wasn't just a myth, he was the myth. Statues of him decorated gymnasia everywhere, flexing eternally, looking down on mortals who could barely manage a push-up without wheezing. Training in front of Heracles wasn't about inspiration, it was about humiliation as motivation. A shrine and a mirror rolled into one, and speaking of mirrors, there weren't any, which means every flex you did had to be felt, not seen. No reflective surfaces, no selfie lighting, just the disapproving gaze of a nearby statue of Athena, silently judging your squat depth. But even judgment had a sacred purpose. The gymnasium. It was a liminal space, somewhere between temple and theater, body and soul, sweat and salvation. It was where you proved not only your strength, but your worth to your peers, to the city, to Olympus. Because here's the catch. In ancient Greece, the body was political. A strong body suggested a strong citizen. A weak body, that was practically treason. To neglect your fitness was to insult not just your city, but the gods who had lent you your muscles in the first place. Let that sink in. Skipping the gym was borderline sacrilegious, and the architecture reflected this. Gymnasia weren't dim, hidden dens of iron and angst. They were open courtyards, framed by colonnades, flanked by lecture halls, altars, and sacred groves. Birds chirped, philosophers loitered. Somewhere in the distance, a flute solo. The vibe was less no pain, no gain, and more bring your soul, and also your death. This was especially true during festivals, where athletic contests were held as offerings to the gods. The most famous of these, of course, were the Olympic Games, originally held in honor of Zeus. Winning wasn't just personal glory, it was a divine nod of approval. Champions didn't get money, they got olive wreaths. Glory was the currency, and behind that glory, the weight of spiritual expectation. But even on an average Tuesday, gymnasia maintained a sense of ceremony. It wasn't just about doing reps. It was how you did them. With grace, with discipline, with humility. Think, less CrossFit rage, more martial arts bow. Strength wasn't power. It was poised. And while we're being poetic, let's pause here. Picture the courtyard in the late afternoon. The sun low, shadows stretching across worn stone. A group of men mid-training, pausing in silence as a priest lights a small flame at the shrine of Apollo. The scent of frankincense curls into the air. Muscles ache, minds quiet. For a brief moment, everything stills, and the body becomes a vessel of reverence. Then someone slips on leftover olive oil and ruins the mood. Such was the balance of the sacred and the absurd. Now, did everyone feel this spiritual weight? Probably not. Just as today's gym-goers range from devoted athletes to casual dabblers, and I'm only here for the steam room types, ancient Greeks had their own spectrum. Some were devout, others were there to peacock. Some were chasing virtue, others were chasing someone's eye across the courtyard. But regardless of motivation, the structure held. Fitness, piety, and public life were inseparable. Modern gyms, by comparison, can feel sterile. Bright lights, branded towels, corporate playlists designed to make you forget you're sweating. But remove the fluorescent buzz, add a couple of altars, and you might get closer to what the Greeks experienced, a strange, transcendent blur of effort and offering. Because to them, flexing wasn't vanity. It was prayer. So the next time you begrudgingly tie your shoes for a workout, consider this. The Greeks believed your effort reached Olympus, that every drop of sweat was part of a much older, stranger, and somehow more noble tradition, where strength was sacred, and the gods were always watching, and maybe judging your posture. Every culture with idealized bodies and spiritualized sweat eventually hits a wall. And for the ancient Greeks, that wall was made of scandal, status, anxiety, and way too much flexing. Sure, the gymnasium looked like a temple of excellence. Marble pillars, sculpted athletes, sacred oaths muttered before wrestling matches. But beneath the sheen of oiled pecs and philosophical virtue was a shadow, one that grew longer the more powerful the gym became. Because while the Greeks claimed their gymnasia were places of enlightenment and discipline, they were also breeding grounds for elitism, exclusion, and the occasional creepy old man pretending to be a mentor. Let's start with access. Despite all the grand talk of virtue and physical excellence, not everyone was invited to the party. Freeborn male citizens, absolutely. Slaves, nope. Foreigners, hard pass. Women, see previous chapter. But even among men, there was a hierarchy, and you could feel it the moment you stepped inside. Or rather, the moment you weren't allowed. 2. Some gymnasia had reputation tiers. The one closest to the agora, for the politically connected, the one near the docks. Less fancy, more sweat. Athletes from the wealthiest families trained with private instructors, wore better sandals, and probably had a dedicated servant to carry their strigil. If you were poor, you showed up early, hoped for space, and prayed no one mocked your tunic's questionable stitching. And while you were scraping oil off your thigh with a bent bronze tool, the aristocratic youth were debating Socratic ethics, and making sure everyone noticed their symmetrical calves. This was Reputation Olympics, and the prize. Status, real social capital. That's right, ancient Greek gym culture was just as much about who you were seen with as what you did. Think country club, but with more nudity and slightly fewer cocktails. Connections were forged in sweat, Deals were whispered between discus throws. Patronage was offered, mentorship extended, sometimes genuinely, sometimes not. Which brings us to the awkward part, the not-so-secret, not-so-platonic underbelly of mentorship culture. See, the gymnasium wasn't just a physical training ground. It was also the stage for the Greek tradition of paiderasty, a socially sanctioned relationship between an older man Orestes and a younger boy Eromenos, framed as a form of education, discipline, and, yes, sometimes affection. In theory, it was about guidance and the transmission of civic virtue. In practice, it got blurry, fast. Philosophers like Plato tried to separate the intellectual from the physical, insisting that true love involved no touching, that beauty inspired the soul, not just the groin. But Plato was also a romantic, and his students didn't always read the footnotes. There were plenty of relationships that strayed from idealism into indulgence, leaving behind an uncomfortable legacy tangled in power dynamics and societal double standards. And in the gymnasium, where naked bodies, mentorship and ambition mixed freely, that power imbalance was right there in the open. A glance held too long, a compliment with weight, a favor that came with conditions. Not all gym interactions were suspect, of course. Many were genuine, respectful, even transformative. But the possibility of exploitation hung in the air like stale sweat. And the younger athletes, those just entering adulthood, were expected to navigate it all with grace, wit, and maybe a little selective hearing. Cue Diogenes. Ah yes, Diogenes of Sinope, the original troll, the philosopher who lived in a barrel, barked at powerful men, and famously wandered the streets with a lantern looking for an honest man. Diogenes hated hypocrisy, and you better believe he had thoughts about the gym. He would strut into these polished palaces of virtue, filthy, barefoot, uninvited, and cause chaos. Once, he masturbated publicly to protest the absurdity of social norms. Another time, he insulted Plato's definition of man by plucking a chicken and presenting it as a featherless biped. Now imagine him in the gymnasium, surrounded by oiled athletes posing like statues, elite youths whispering political strategies, and philosophers overcomplicating push-ups. Diogenes shows up with nothing but cynicism and an overwhelming stench, mocking their rituals, questioning their ethics, probably stealing someone's lunch while giving a speech on self-sufficiency. In short, Diogenes reminded everyone that virtue isn't always sculpted. Sometimes it lives in mud. But Diogenes wasn't the only critic. By the later classical period, other philosophers began to raise eyebrows too. They warned of the moral decline brewing inside the gymnasia, that instead of breeding civic virtue, they were breeding vanity, narcissism, pride so inflated it needed its own stridule. There's a scene described in one Athenian satire where a man walks into the gym not to train, but to parade. He circles slowly, flexes subtly, adjusts his headband repeatedly, all while avoiding any actual exertion. It's all for show. He leaves without breaking a sweat, but convinced he's better than you. Sound familiar? Because that's the thing. The more elite a space becomes, the more it risks losing the very purpose it was built for. The gym, once about self-discipline, civic duty, and divine aspiration, became for some a theater of performance, where virtue was not earned but imitated, where strength was a costume, not a character trait. Let's breathe here. Picture the courtyard again. The sun is high, the voice is low. A young man hesitates at the gate. He's unsure if he belongs. Not because he's weak, but because his sandals aren't the right brand. He steps in anyway, trains hard, sweats honestly, but no one sees him, because everyone's watching the boy with golden curls and a father in the Senate. That's the shadow. It doesn't strangle you. It ignores you. So what do we lose when the gym becomes a mirror instead of a forge? When being seen matters more than being strong? When flexing replaces fellowship? The Greeks wrestled with this, literally and philosophically, and so do we. Because every space built for excellence runs the risk of becoming exclusive. Every altar invites idolatry. Every dumbbell comes with a dumb ego waiting to be inflated. But maybe the solution isn't destruction. Maybe it's remembering that virtue isn't loud. That strength, real strength, often trains in silence. If you're imagining ancient Greek gyms as primitive places where men just slapped each other with philosophy until their pecs improved, well, you're not entirely wrong. But they did have equipment, real gear, tools designed to test muscle, bone, and pride. No treadmills, no Bluetooth-enabled anything. Just raw, unsympathetic objects whose sole purpose was to humble you in front of your peers. First up, the strategial. If the gymnasium had a mascot, it would be this: a curved metal scraper used to remove oil, sweat, and dust from the body. Sounds harmless, right? Try dragging a cold bronze blade across your thigh after sprinting barefoot on stone. It wasn't so much a cleansing tool as a medieval exfoliator with attitude. One misjudged angle and you were bleeding into the sand. Still, every man had one. Some strigils were plain. Others were ornate with inscriptions, embellishments, status symbols, masquerading as hygiene. Picture a luxury loofah, but one that occasionally left scars. They were kept in gymnasiarchs' lockers, often alongside small oil flasks and tiny sponges that, somehow, always failed to get the job done. And if you forgot your strigil, you borrowed someone else's, and hoped they weren't contagious, but enough about scraping. Let's talk about lifting. Enter the halters, the ancient Greek answer to dumbbells. Except, instead of adjustable chrome-plated cylinders, these were solid lumps of stone or metal shaped like flattened boomerangs. They didn't come with instructions. You either figured them out or looked foolish. And being foolish in a courtyard full of naked philosophers, that's how reputations die. The halters were used primarily in the long jump. Yes, jumping with weights. The Greeks believed holding halters improved distance by creating momentum during the leap and stability during the landing. It's like doing parkour while carrying 2 bricks and hoping physics is on your side. Jumpers would swing their arms rhythmically, launch themselves forward, and land ideally in a sandpit, though occasionally on an unsuspecting tortoise or careless poet. The technique was part sport, part spectacle, and completely unforgiving. If your rhythm was off, you didn't jump, you just kind of flopped forward like a tragic mime. But halters weren't just for show. They were also used for strength training, curls, shoulder raises, resistance drills. Ever tried swinging 2 10-pound stones in perfect synchronicity while an older man critiques your posture using Homeric similes? Ancient fitness wasn't subtle. It was trial by gravity. Next up, sandbags. Not the slick, militarized versions we see today, but crude. Heavy sacks filled with sand or grain, used for striking, lifting, or dragging. Think of them as the kettlebells of antiquity, unbalanced, irregular, and designed to punish any lapse. In concentration, these were favored by boxers and wrestlers, who trained to deliver blows with precision and absorb them without crumpling like a poorly packed toga. Boxing itself was brutal. and so were the tools. The Greeks used leather straps wrapped around the hands and wrists, meant to protect the bones, but also to turn every punch into a lightly sharpened insult. Imagine a sparring session where your knuckles are half bandaged, half weaponized, and your opponent quotes Euripides between jabs. But perhaps the most impressive tool in the Greek gym was the body itself. Every muscle was trained to perfection, not with flashy equipment, but with functional intensity. Push-ups, grappling drills, foot races in uneven terrain, sprinting across dusty courtyards, dodging goats, while your instructor yelled something about achieving harmony through pain. Very on brand. And unlike modern gyms, where you might plug into a playlist to drown out the suffering, Greek athletes had only their breath, their heartbeat, and the occasional distant lyre music to motivate them. No EDM, no podcasts, just sheer, echoing silence interrupted by strained breathing and philosophical banter. Let's pause here. Picture it. A man stands alone in the courtyard, halters in hand, sweat dripping from his brow. He swings them in practiced rhythm, arms cutting through the air, body twisting in anticipation. He leaps, lands. The sand shifts beneath him. There's no applause, no personal best tracker, just the quiet satisfaction of repetition, of mastery slowly earned, scraped from stone. And son, the tools weren't complicated. They didn't need to be. The Greeks weren't chasing efficiency. They were chasing excellence. And excellence doesn't come from gadgets. It comes from grit. But not all tools were equal. Just as with everything in Greek society, gym equipment reflected status. Wealthier athletes had better halters, smoother stone, balanced weight. Their strigils were engraved with verses or family crests. Their oil imported, their sand finely sifted. It sounds ridiculous, and it was. Because even in a place supposedly devoted to self-improvement, materialism snuck in wearing a laurel wreath. That subtle class divide showed up in training, too. The poor used worn-down equipment, trained on rougher ground, scraped themselves, raw with cheap metal. The rich glided through rituals with better tools, better coaches, better everything. And yet, on competition day, none of that mattered if you slipped in the first 10 seconds and face-planted into the long jump pit. So maybe that was the point. The tools could help. But they couldn't win the contest for you. And that brings us back to the gymnasium. Dusty, sun-drenched, loud with motion. The strigils gleam. The halters rest like waiting challengers. A boy picks one up for the first time, unsure. A man wipes his brow, scarred but stronger. In this space, these tools weren't just for fitness. They were for transformation. Not from weak to strong, from uncertain to whole. Somewhere in the middle of a sun-bleached courtyard, a young man is holding a discus with one hand and an identity crisis in the other. He's sweating, he's shirtless. He's trying to remember the form his coach screamed at him yesterday. And also wondering if the pursuit of physical perfection is inherently a form of ego inflation. Welcome to the Greek gymnasium, where your biceps weren't just muscles, they were metaphors. See, in ancient Greece, the body and mind were not enemies. They weren't even rivals. They were co-workers, reluctantly collaborating on the ultimate group project, the virtuous self. Physical excellence wasn't a shallow aesthetic goal, it was a philosophical one. Training your body was seen as a direct investment in your soul. And no one was louder about this than Plato, philosopher, student of Socrates, and part-time wrestler. Yes, that Plato. The man whose name now collects dust in University Salabi once squared up in the wrestling ring. In fact, his nickname Platon likely referred to his broad shoulders. You don't get called wide boy without putting in some serious time at the Palaestra. Plato believed in katathea, the union of physical beauty, kalos, and moral goodness, agathos. According to him, a well-developed body was a sign of a well-developed soul, which, conveniently, made gym selfies a form of self-reflection. Too bad they didn't have Instagram. Imagine the hashtags. Socrates, his mentor, and everyone's favorite. Barefoot nuisance also hung round the gymnasia, but not to train. Oh no, Socrates preferred lurking. He'd corner unsuspecting youths mid-stretch, bombarding them with questions like, what is courage? Or is virtue teachable? Imagine trying to hit your PR on squats while a bearded man with halitosis demands you define justice. But that was the point. For the Greeks, philosophy didn't live in ivory towers. It lived in sweat and repetition. You didn't isolate wisdom to the classroom. You tested it under stress, mid-run, mid-wrestle. That's where the truth showed up. And there was an undeniable respect for those who walked both paths. A strong thinker with strong arms. That was peak humanity. Because what good was a brilliant mind if your body collapsed under the weight of your own arguments? And what good were rippling pecs if they weren't backed by disciplined thought? Let's pause and imagine a training session. A young athlete, full of ambition and olive oil, runs laps around the courtyard. Nearby, a philosopher watches, nodding approvingly. After the run, the youth approaches, breathing hard. Master, he says, I ran faster than yesterday. Excellent, replies the philosopher. And did you also think deeper? Because improvement wasn't linear, it was holistic. You trained your legs, yes, but also your conscience. Strength without wisdom was dangerous. Wisdom without strength, useless. And yet, as noble as this sounds, let's not pretend every gym goer was a secret sage. For every platonic idealist sculpting his soul between crunches, there was a guy named Nicandros, flexing for attention, and Loki hoping someone nearby was sketching him for a future statue. But even the posers benefited from the culture. You couldn't help but absorb some philosophy while training next to men who spoke in metaphors and quoted Pindar during cooldowns. The environment itself demanded reflection. The architecture, the rituals, the expectation that every action carried meaning. Even rest days were philosophical. Take the symposium, technically a drinking party, but also a place where athletes and thinkers gathered post-training to discuss ethics, poetry, and occasionally whose thighs looked most like bronze. It was recovery, reflection, and reputation, management all in one. But let's get a little deeper. Why this obsession with harmonizing the body and the mind? Because to the Greeks, imbalance was chaos. A body pursued without wisdom became vanity. A mind cultivated without physical discipline became arrogance. Harmony, that sweet, elusive balance, was the ideal. It created the kind of citizen who could debate laws in the assembly, fight in the phalanx, and look aesthetically pleasing while doing both. Modern gyms don't quite capture that. Today, physical training and intellectual development often live in separate worlds. The gym rat and the bookworm rarely overlap. One lifts weights, the other lifts existential dread. But in ancient Greece, you were expected to do both. And if you couldn't, maybe you weren't a complete human yet. It's worth reflecting on that. Have we lost something by compartmentalizing our growth? by acting as though intellect and physicality are two different lanes instead of two legs of the same journey. Because Plato wasn't trying to build bodybuilders. He was trying to build balanced souls, people who could think critically, act ethically, and run fast enough to escape metaphorical bears and real ones. So yes, the gymnasium was where you trained your body, but it was also where you questioned your motives, where you failed publicly, then examined what failure meant, where you wrestled other people, sure, but also wrestled your ego, and if you got a six-pack along the way. Even better, let's close with an image. The sun is setting over the gym courtyard. A group of young men finish their drills. Their instructor, a wiry old philosopher with more wrinkles than sandals, gathers them in a circle. They sit, he speaks. You've trained your bodies. Now train your thoughts. What is virtue? What is justice? What does it mean to be good? And in that golden hour glow, their breath still ragged, sweat drying on their skin, they begin to answer, not because they're ready, but because they're learning that strength is a dialogue, always has been. Let's say you've just finished a morning of intense ancient Greek training. Halters flung, strigil scraped, philosopher dodged. You're drenched in oil, dust, and existential fatigue. You've earned your recovery, but you're not heading home yet. No, you're going to the bathhouse, where the real workout begins, navigating the sudsy minefield of reputation, flirtation, and social espionage. Welcome to the ancient Greek bathhouse, the unofficial sequel to the gymnasium. Here bodies were cleansed, stories were swapped, and reputations were either built or boiled alive in the steam room. The bathhouse wasn't optional, it was expected. You couldn't just strut around Athens looking like you lost a wrestling match with an olive tree. Cleanliness, after all, was next to godliness, and also next to people who would absolutely talk behind your back if you skipped your rinse cycle. Personal hygiene was civic hygiene. If you showed up dirty, you didn't just offend nostrils. You offended democracy. But the bath wasn't just about washing. It was a ritual. First, you'd scrape off your oil and sweat with the beloved possibly with help from a slave or a fellow athlete if you were feeling particularly Roman about it. Then came the hot water, poured or soaked, depending on the setup. Some bathhouses had full immersion pools. Others just had basins and ladles. And trust me, there's nothing dignified about ladling lukewarm water onto yourself while pretending not to eavesdrop, and oh, the eavesdropping. The bathhouse was an echo chamber of whispers and splashes. Politics, poetry, flattery, blackmail. It all steamed together in a soup of half-naked secrets. Philosophers gossiped, athletes bragged. Senators murmured about proposed tax reforms while someone's teenage son complained that his street got stolen. Again, it was like a Twitter thread come to life. But everyone was wet and smelled vaguely of eucalyptus. There was a hierarchy, of course. Just like in the gymnasium, not everyone bathed equally. Wealthy men had access to private or semi-private baths, complete with attendants and aromatic oils. The less fortunate made do with public facilities, often crowded, noisy, and dangerously slippery. Slaves cleaned, merchants mingled, and at the center of it all was the unspoken rule: be seen, but not too seen. Because the bathhouse was a paradox, a place where everyone was exposed, but no one was supposed to notice. Nudity was normal, but littering, scandalous. Modesty was performed in how you carried yourself, how quickly you dressed after bathing, how little you responded when someone casually mentioned your thigh definition. Still, the tension hung in the steam. Eyes wandered, conversations dipped below the surface, and sometimes gossip turned dangerous. Let's talk about a scandal. There was an athlete, call him Theo, famous for his discus throw, infamous for his tendency to flirt with anything that moved. After a particularly intense gymnasium session, Theocritos wandered into the bathhouse, still glowing with victory and pomposity. He bathed, he boasted. He may or may not have made a suggestive remark to the son of a local magistrate. The next morning, his prized strigil was gone. A week later, so was his sponsorship. Coincidence? Of course not. Bathhouse politics were ruthless. Objects went missing. Rumors spread. Rivalries ignited. One athlete accused another of using imported oil, a grave insult, since foreign oil was considered inferior and vaguely barbaric. Another man was exiled, not for treason, but because he insulted a judge's feet in the steam room. These weren't just social spaces, they were arenas, and every casual remark was a potential dagger. But not all bathhouse drama was malicious. Sometimes it was poetic. A poet named Antiphalos reportedly composed verses on the wall tiles using leftover bathwater and charcoal. One read, "Steam lifts the body, words lift the soul." Another simply said, "Who took my sandals?" Let's pause. Imagine the bathhouse. Near sunset, the water is warm, the light golden. A group of men sits quietly, soaking. One recites a line of Homer, another hums softly. The chaos of the gym fades. For a moment there is stillness, a shared silence, a human exhale, and then someone farts. Loudly, "Welcome back." Because this was still ancient Greece. For every sublime moment of serenity, there was an awkward bodily noise, a dropped towel, or a philosophical debate about whether soap undermines masculinity. And yes, they did have soap, sort of. It was usually a crude paste made of ash and fat, used sparingly and with suspicion. Many preferred oil and scraping, less foam, more friction. Still, hygiene mattered. Disease was a real threat. And while germ theory hadn't been invented yet, everyone instinctively understood that sharing a bath with 50 strangers came with certain risks. So water was refreshed often, floors were cleaned, and attendants, the silent, overworked MVPs, kept everything from descending into full chaos. It's easy to think of the bathhouse as a relic of a simpler time. But in truth, it was complex, a place where public and private blurred, where the body was laid bare, but the mind stayed armored. You cleaned yourself, but you also watched, you listened, you learned. Who was rising in the political ranks? Who was losing favor? Who slipped in the marble room and is now suing the city council? It was all here, in the steam, in the splash, in the subtle eye roll, over someone's choice of post-bath tunic. So what does that tell us? That even in the most vulnerable places, soaked, stripped, exhausted, people still performed, still calculated, still played the game, because reputation never rested, not in the gym, not in the bath, not even when you were covered in lather and trying to avoid eye contact with your ex-mentor. And when the bath was done, you dried off, re-oiled, and stepped back into the world, cleaner, yes, but also recalibrated. Not just your body, but your place in it. The Olympics, that sacred Greek tradition where men ran naked in circles for divine approval and lifelong bragging rights. Born in 776 BCE and dedicated to Zeus himself, the Olympic Games were supposed to represent the pinnacle of human achievement, athletic, spiritual, civic, but for every chariot of glory, there was a wheel of corruption wobbling behind it. Let's start with the dream. The Olympic ideal wasn't just about speed, strength, or stamina. It was about arete, that all-purpose Greek word for excellence. Competing at Olympia meant you weren't just physically elite, but morally upright. You were supposed to embody the values of your polis, represent your people, and honor the gods. The prize, a crown of wild olive leaves. That's it. No medals, no cash. Just a leafy head accessory, and your name inscribed in the dust of memory. Sounds noble, right? Like the world's most inconvenient yoga retreat. But peel back that olive wreath, and you'll find a very different story. One of bribery, sabotage, social climbing, and the timeless art of pretending to be humble while absolutely not being humble. For starters, the games were anything but inclusive. Only freeborn Greek men could compete. Not women, not slaves, not foreigners. If you weren't born into the right demographic, your excellence didn't matter. The starting line wasn't even yours to approach. And even among those eligible, politics ran the show. City-states sent athletes not just to win, but to win for them. A victory wasn't personal, it was propaganda. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, each wanted to flex its superiority, not just in war or rhetoric, but in discus throwing. The gymnasium and the stadium were arms of the same campaign, influence through idealized bodies, and where influence goes, corruption follows. Take cheating. The Greeks weren't above it. Athletes took shortcuts, sometimes literal ones, jumping the starting line, bribing judges, or even hiring stand-ins. That's right, ancient performance-enhancing fraud didn't require steroids, just someone who vaguely resembled you and could run fast. When caught, cheaters were fined. Their punishment: funding a statue, a Zanes displayed near the entrance to Olympia, engraved with their name and sin. Imagine walking into your big race and seeing a lineup of shameful reminders that yes, cheating is forever, and now your uncle has to explain it every time he visits Dot. And then there was oil doping. No, really. Some athletes were accused of using specially mixed oils to enhance muscle definition or improve stamina. One recipe supposedly included crushed rose petals, goat fat, and a dash of snake venom. Whether it worked or just made them smell like an apocalyptic garden is unclear. Still, the most powerful performance enhancer wasn't oil, it was money. Rich athletes had access to better training, better coaches, and better nutrition, which in Greek terms meant more figs, fewer parasites. They could afford to take months off to prepare, hire poets to hype them up, and arrive at Olympia looking like freshly carved statues. Poorer athletes, they trained between jobs, carried their own equipment, and hoped the gods were feeling generous. Spoiler: the gods were usually busy with nepotism. And then there were the spectators. Tens of thousands of Greeks traveled to Olympia through heat, dust, and goat traffic to witness the spectacle. The games were part holy festival, part political convention, part very sweaty family reunion. Merchants sold souvenirs, poets performed odes, philosophers preached, and somewhere in the chaos, an athlete hurled a javelin so hard it impaled a loaf of someone's lunch. The atmosphere was electric and volatile. Fights broke out. Gambling thrived. There were even riots when certain city-states accused others of bribing officials. One year, Sparta was banned entirely, not for losing, for being too aggressive about winning. And let's not forget the infamous chariot races. On paper, they were the height of Olympic glory. 4-horse teams careening around tight turns, wheels, inches from disaster, all in service of speed and spectacle. But the owner of the horses, not the driver, got the victory. This led to some rich citizens winning without ever touching the reins. The most famous, our old friend Caniska of Sparta, the first woman to technically win at the Olympics by owning the horses. A loophole so clever, it deserves its own laurel wreath. Still, others used the same tactic, less heroically, with wealthier men buying up fast teams and claiming all the glory while the drivers risked being trampled into oblivion. Even in a world without Instagram, clout was everything. Let's pause. Imagine a dusty afternoon in Olympia. The crowd roars. Two runners, neck and neck in the stadium race, muscles straining, sandals barely brushing the dirt. One pulls ahead. The crowd erupts. He crosses the line, victorious. And somewhere, behind the scenes, a politician smiles. Because this isn't just a race, it's an advertisement. That's the ugly truth hiding behind the olive crown. The Olympic ideal. A noble aspiration, absolutely. But beneath it lurked ambition, manipulation, and more than a few carefully curated myths. Because no matter how many times Plato waxed poetic about harmonious souls, the games were just as much about winning in the most public, glorious, strategic way possible. And when so much was at stake, morality occasionally pulled a hamstring. Still, even in their mesinzas, the games mattered. They inspired art, poetry, architecture. They paused wars, literally. A sacred truce, the Ikacheria, was declared during the festival to ensure safe passage for athletes and spectators alike. That's right, the Olympics was so sacred, even murderers took a week off. So what do we make of this? That greatness is complicated. That even the purest ideals get tangled in real-world ambition. And maybe, just maybe, that the Greeks understood this too. Which is why, right next to the statues of champions, they also carved the names of cheaters. Because to them, the truth of excellence wasn't in perfection, it was in the attempt. If history has a favorite plot twist, it's this: everything that once defined greatness eventually becomes ... awkward, or worse, uncool. And so it was with the ancient Greek gymnasium. Once the glittering shrine to nudity, discipline, and ego with a side of philosophy, it would eventually fall out of fashion like a discarded tunic, replaced by modesty, suspicion, and Roman architecture with a flair for the dramatic. So, how do you go from sacred naked squats to covered ankles and cultural discomfort? Enter Rome. Now, Rome didn't hate nudity. The early Romans actually admired much of Greek culture, especially the art, the architecture, and the part where people fought each other in front of crowds for entertainment. But when it came to gyms, the Romans had ... thoughts. For starters, they preferred baths to training. Roman thermae were enormous, luxurious, often gaudier than Caesar's ego, and focused less on athleticism and more on chilling, gossiping, and pretending to work out while eating dates. Exercise was still important, but it was increasingly seen as a means to an end, not a philosophical pursuit. The body still admired, but not quite worshipped, and the nudity that became ... complicated. See, the Romans saw Greek-style nudity as a bit too unstructured, too soft, too Greek. Roman masculinity leaned toward the practical, functional armor, stoic faces, minimal oil. The idea of fully nude public training started to seem, how shall we put this, uncomfortably intimate, especially as Roman society grew more conservative and military-focused. Suddenly, That glistening, open-air courtyard looked less like a temple of virtue and more like an awkward toga party with too many philosophers. And then, as if to ice the abs of cultural change, Christianity arrived. Now, to be clear, early Christianity didn't immediately start burning gymnasia or banning jogging, but its values clashed hard with Greek body culture. Where the Greeks saw beauty in the exposed human form, divine, aspirational, the Christians saw temptation. Flesh became frailty, vanity, a reminder of original sin, not original sculpting. Modesty was elevated. Discipline shifted from physical to spiritual. The naked body, once a canvas of excellence, became something to be hidden, protected from judgment, desire, and dust. Public nudity, even in the context of training, started to look less like heroism and more like heresy. Gymnasia, emptied. Some were repurposed, turned into schools, marketplaces, even churches. Others crumbled into ruins, their colonnades overtaken by weeds, their stone floors no longer warmed by ambition. The strigils rusted, the halters disappeared. The echoes of argument and effort faded beneath layers of silence and shifting priorities, and in that silence, something else was lost. The philosophy of the body. Because even with all its ego and exclusivity, the Greek gym had been about integration. Mind and muscle, flesh and thought. The modern replacement, not so much. The divide between physicality and intellect widened. Scholars retreated into libraries, athletes into arenas. The gym was no longer where you went to find virtue. It was just ... where you sweated. But the shift wasn't only ideological. It was personal. For generations raised in the shadow of Christian morality, the idea of standing naked before others, of being seen, became associated with shame, vulnerability, exposure in the worst sense. The very thing the Greeks celebrated was now the thing to be hidden, covered, avoided. Let's pause. Imagine a young man in late antiquity. He's heard stories, old ones, about the golden age of Athens, of wrestlers and philosophers training side by side. He finds the remains of a gymnasium on the edge of town. Stone pillars cracked, the sand pit overgrown. He stands where others once trained, once taught, once reached for some impossible idea of excellence. But he doesn't undress, he doesn't run, he just stares, because the rituals no longer make sense. The culture that created them is gone, and the body, once a symbol of power and pride, now feels like something else entirely. That's the tragedy of it. The naked gym didn't just fall out of fashion, it was forgotten, its values buried beneath layers of moral reinterpretation and shifting societal tastes. The pursuit of the ideal body, once a sacred offering, became a private endeavor, stripped of its context, its ceremony, its soul. And so the gymnasium faded, not with a bang, but with a robe. And yet, the memory lingers. You can still see it in the ruins of Olympia, in the sculptures, in museums, in the fragments of philosophy that managed to survive the purges. The idea that the body matters, that training it can be a form of honor, that excellence is not just something you think, but something you do with limbs, breath, struggle. It's still there, waiting, and maybe, just maybe, not entirely gone. Because here's the question. What does it say about a culture when it starts covering up the very thing it once worshipped? What does it say about us? Picture this. Fluorescent lighting hums overhead. Pop music blares from invisible speakers. A man in Bluetooth headphones does half-hearted bicep curls while filming himself in the mirror. Somewhere, a woman in yoga. PANTS. Sidesteps a puddle of protein shake. There's a vending machine full of energy bars that taste like pressed mulch. And someone in the corner is arguing with the treadmill. Welcome to the modern gym, temple of gains, altar of aesthetics. And, if the ancient Greeks could see it, a tragic parody of its former self. Because for all its chrome plating and subscription plans, the contemporary fitness center is not a descendant of the ancient gymnasium. It's a clone, a carefully engineered, hyper-branded replica of what once had soul. Let's rewind. In classical Greece, the gymnasium was a crucible of self-mastery. You didn't go there just to sweat. You went to train your character. You debated ethics while stretching your hamstrings. You wrestled not just with people, but with purpose. The gym was a polis in miniature, the physical, intellectual, and moral entwined in a single sandy courtyard. Now, you're lucky if your gym has working showers and dumbbells that aren't mysteriously sticky. So how did we get here? In short, somewhere along the line, fitness got monetized, industrialized, turned into a lifestyle rather than a practice. The gym became a stage, not a sanctuary. Mirrors replaced mentors. Algorithms replaced introspection. And suddenly, we weren't training for virtue. We were training for validation. Look around. The layout of most modern gyms is designed for surveillance. Not just from staff, but from each other. Open floor plans. Wall-to-wall mirrors. The subtle implication that if no one saw your deadlift, did it even happen? The answer, according to Instagram, no. Even the equipment has shifted from utility to spectacle. Treadmills with 15 buttons and zero guidance. Smith machines designed to protect you from your own ambition. And rowing machines that are more often used as coat racks. It's fitness theater, with poorly written dialogue. But it's not just the tools, it's the tone. The ancient gym was unapologetically communal. Men trained together, vulnerable and exposed, literally and figuratively. They learned from each other, failed in front of each other. Strength was relational. It grew in the soil of mentorship and shared suffering. Modern gyms, not so much. Today, we wear headphones as armor, keep our eyes low, treat conversation like a breach of personal space. We're in a room full of people doing the same thing at the same time. And somehow, it's one of the loneliest experiences available for $59.99 a month. And let's talk about identity back then. The body was not just a billboard. It was a reflection of moral character. A strong body meant a disciplined soul. You trained to become a better citizen, a better thinker, a better human down. You train to become a before and after photo. You train for followers, for symmetry, for someone else's double tap. The soul is no longer part of the equation. It's an optional, Adon-like towel service. Let's pause here. Imagine a Greek athlete, call him Leonidas, transported into a modern gym. He's barefoot, oiled, and confused. He sees machines that move, but go nowhere. He sees people lifting weights only to put them back down. He hears a woman yelling at her smartwatch, demanding it recognize her calorie burn. He sees a man flexing in the mirror while adjusting his hat for maximum jawline. He doesn't speak English, but he understands exactly what's happening. No one here is training for arete now. That's not to say modern gyms are useless. Far from it. They've made fitness more accessible, more inclusive, and in some cases, more effective. You can walk in off the street, out of shape and overwhelmed, and find a machine that helps you begin. That matters. That's good. But accessibility without philosophy is just noise. We've built spaces for the body, but we've forgotten the spirit that once filled them. The Greeks didn't separate mind and muscle. They didn't see reps as punishment. They saw them as practice, for life, for death, for everything in between. And yes, they were elitist, exclusionary, and sometimes uncomfortably obsessed with glutes. But they believed in the gym as a place of becoming. Not just becoming attractive, but becoming whole. We've lost that. The modern gym tells you how to lose weight, but not how to carry it. It shows you how to build strength, but not why. It sells you programs, gear, influencers, but never asks who you want to become beyond the mirror. Let that sink in, because maybe that's the lie. Not the reps, not the equipment, not the apps, but the illusion that fitness is an endpoint, a final form, a visible trophy. When the Greeks would have told you fitness was never the point, it was the portal to wisdom, to resilience, to humility. So next time you walk into a gym, consider this. It's not about the perfect playlist. It's not about burning 500 calories. It's not even about muscle. It's about motion, intent, a space, however imperfect, to rediscover yourself in. The act of trying, and maybe, just maybe, to make peace with the fact that even in your most unflattering angle, you are already enough. You thought the ancient Greek obsession with the body died with togas and strigils. Think again, because like a six-pack rising from the ashes of 1,000 skipped-leg days, the body cult is back, slicker, shinier, and now, with Wi-Fi, we traded marble statues for Instagram filters, olive oil for pre-workout powder, and philosophical dialogues for gym bro podcasts recorded in someone's garage. Welcome to the modern resurrection of an ancient fixation. The body as brand. The body as billboard. The body as sacred object once again, but now edited in Lightroom and set to lo-fi beats. It's not a stretch to say we've resurrected Greek ideals, we just gave them ring lights and affiliate codes. Let's start with the influencers. You've seen them, smiling through push-ups, giving you unsolicited advice on your posture from the beach, preaching discipline, hustle, and gut health, all while subtly flexing in 4K. These are our modern Heracles, part deity, part marketing campaign. They don't just train, they curate. Their bodies are evidence of moral superiority, of work ethic, of a lifestyle you too can unlock if you click the link in their bio. They sell transformation, but what they're really selling is identity. Unlike the Greeks, they believe the body is the message. If you're shredded, you must be virtuous. If you're symmetrical, surely you're wise. If your abs could cut glass, surely your soul is bulletproof. And behind every posed photo is a ritual. Meal prep like a priestess, preparing offerings. Gym selfies like devotional candles. Macro tracking like a modern form of stoicism. Deny the donut. Accept the suffering. Post the cheat day for relatability. But make sure the lighting still slaps. It's absurd, and it's exactly what the Greeks would have done if they'd had TikTok. But it's not just the influencers, it's the culture. Biohackers chase optimization, like it's Olympus, cryotherapy, intermittent fasting, cold plunges at 5 a.m. while quoting Marcus Aurelius. Everyone's trying to ascend. The gym isn't just a place anymore, it's a ritual space. CrossFit boxes have become modern, palastre, tribal, intense, oddly poetic. Soul cycle classes are cultish in the most cardio-efficient way. And don't even get me started on Silicon Valley wellness retreats, meditation pods, keto-focused ideologies, wearables that buzz when your heart rate dares to act human. We're not far off from sacrificing a protein bar to Apollo before every set. What we're seeing isn't just a return to fitness. It's a rebirth of the belief that the body reveals the soul, that by sculpting yourself, you become yourself, which, to be fair, can be true. There is value in discipline, in routine, in movement that aligns body and mind. But the danger, and it's the same danger the Greeks faced, is when the image becomes the goal. When the performance overtakes the purpose, when we confuse abs for wisdom and filters for virtue. Because while Greek statues were idealized, they were never real. They were aspirations, not expectations. They stood still, silent, symbols. Today, we've blurred the line between inspiration and obligation. We see perfection on our screens and wonder why we aren't it. We chase shadows, algorithmically enhanced, and call it self-improvement. Let's pause, imagine a modern man. Let's call him Theo. He wakes at dawn, scrolls through reels of glistening torsos and smoothie hacks. He drags himself to the gym, half motivated, half ashamed. He trains hard, posts a progress shot, waits for validation, feels ... nothing. Because the Greeks at least had one advantage. They believed the gods were watching. We believe everyone is, and that constant visibility breeds anxiety, not excellence. Still, it's not all grim. There are flashes of authenticity in the noise. Movements that center joy over judgment. Spaces that celebrate all bodies, not just the statuesque. People who lift for clarity, run for mental health, dance because it feels like freedom, and maybe, in those moments, we touch something ancient, because the Greeks didn't just train to impress. They trained to express, to belong, to rise to a higher version of themselves, however flawed. Their rituals may have been drenched in ego, but beneath that was longing to be seen, understood, accepted in motion. The modern body cult wears new clothes, but its heartbeat is old. It whispers, you are what you sculpt, you are what you show, you are what you endure. So yes, the body cult is back, but maybe it never left, still watching. Then you know what to do. Stretch, like, and sub. We'll keep the oil optional. Let's take a breath, not a heaving, adrenaline-fueled gasp between deadlifts, a slow one, inhale, exhale, because for all the ridiculousness we've inherited from our oiled-up ancestors, we've also preserved something beautiful, something quietly profound. In the modern gym, in the trail run, in the yoga studio at the back of your grocery store, the Greeks are still with us, not in togas, thank the gods, but in spirit. This chapter isn't about mockery. It's about what we still get right. At its core, the Greek gymnasium was a place of becoming, of self-refinement through effort. And despite the fluorescent lighting and dubious motivational slogans on our walls, pain is weakness leaving the body, says the vinyl decal. That spirit persists. We still gather in shared spaces to move, to sweat, to test ourselves against invisible limits. We still seek transformation, not just in shape, but in self. Consider the quiet act of a morning jog. No audience, no music, just footfalls, breath, rhythm. This is philosophy in motion, a meditation by muscle. With every step, we affirm something the Greeks knew. That movement can make the mind malleable. That clarity comes not just in stillness, but in stride. Or look at dance, not as performance, but as catharsis. Movement for joy, grief, expression. Ancient Greek rituals included ecstatic dances to Dionysus, divine chaos embodied. Today, we dance in studios, clubs, living rooms, alone or together, for reasons even we can't always explain. And maybe that's the point. The body sometimes speaks what the soul hasn't figured out how to say yet. Martial arts, climbing, swimming, walking. These aren't just activities. They're languages, practices that teach us things we forget in static life. Resilience, discipline, presence. How to fail without shame. How to breathe when things get hard. How to keep going. And then there's community. Despite the rise of solo, workouts and personalized fitness apps that track your heart rate more intimately than most partners ever will, something about exercising together endures. Group classes, running clubs, pick-up basketball. We still crave shared motion. Not because it burns more calories, but because it connects. That was the real magic of the gymnasium. Not the oil, not the abs, the camaraderie, the sense that becoming better, stronger, wiser, more whole, is something we do side by side. And, sure, today's gym culture has its flaws. The influencers, the shame cycles, the pressure to look perfect while somehow radiating humility. But peel that away and you'll find something hopeful underneath. People everywhere, trying to show up, trying to change, trying to understand themselves through movement. Isn't that what the Greeks were doing too? Let's pause again. Picture a woman in her 70s, alone on a yoga mat. Her knees hurt. Her balance isn't what it was. But she breathes. She stretches. Not to impress. Not to compete. But to feel alive, present, whole. That is ancient. That is sacred. Or a teenager lifting weights after school, headphones in, learning how to be in his body for the first time. How to inhabit it. That too is a kind of philosophy. Messy, hormonal, vulnerable, but real. Even pain, when chosen, can be clarifying. Ask any runner who's hit mile 10 and had an epiphany about their career. Or a boxer who's found calm in a flurry of jabs. Or anyone who's gritted their teeth through a plank and discovered, to their shock, that they didn't quit this time. The Greeks knew suffering. They revered it, not masochistically, but as a forge. And we awkward, modern, over-caffeinated, still step into that fire willingly. Maybe not in marble courtyards, but in strip-mall gyms and parking lot boot camps and cracked sidewalks. We test ourselves. We fail. We come back. That matters. Because somewhere in all the sweat and soreness is a question, not how do I look, but who am I becoming? That's philosophy, not in a book, but in the body. So yes, we've traded tunics for leggings and oil for electrolyte powder, but we're still chasing something timeless. Harmony, balance, the idea that body and mind are not enemies to be tamed, but instruments to be tuned. Maybe that's what we've kept, or maybe it's what we're rediscovering. Let that settle, because despite the noise, the clanging plates, the gym bro advice, the relentless sales pitch of modern fitness, there are still moments, quiet ones, honest ones, where we remember what movement is supposed to do, not change how we look, but how we live. And that, dear viewers, is how Socrates would have dropped a dumbbell behind every dumbbell lifted and every treadmill run today. Lies a story, not just about reps or calories, but about human struggle, vulnerability, and transformation. The gym isn't just a place where bodies change. It's where identities are tested, shame is confronted, and strength, sometimes invisible, is born. Take Marcus, for example. He wasn't always the man who could bench press twice his body weight. A decade ago, he was drowning in grief after losing his brother. The weight of loss pressed heavier than any iron. Therapy helped, but it was the act of showing up at the gym, day after reluctant day, that saved him. Not because he wanted to look good, because moving, breathing, fighting the pull of despair was how he reclaimed himself. Every drop of sweat was a silent promise. I will keep going, or Sarah. For years, the gym was a place of anxiety. She'd walk in, feel the eyes of strangers dissect her body, judge her unshapely curves, and shrink. The treadmill was a treadmill to nowhere, a place where shame ran alongside her. But one day, she joined a beginner's class when no one knew her story. The encouragement was quiet but fierce. The shared struggle undeniable. Slowly, the gym stopped being a battleground and became a sanctuary. She learned strength wasn't about perfection, it was about persistence. These stories echo ancient struggles. The naked gym was a place of judgment, sure, but also of possibility. Vulnerability was on display, but so was resilience. And it's that tension that makes the gym a microcosm of human life. Modern gyms may lack olive oil and philosophy debates, but they pulse with the same raw emotions: fear of being seen, desire to improve, the silent hope that today will be better than yesterday. It's not always pretty, it's not always triumphant, but it's real, and real is enough. Consider the man who steps into the gym after years away. His body remembers the pain of aging, the echo of old injuries, but he shows up. Every creak, every ache is a reminder not of weakness but of survival. Or the woman who lifts weights to quiet the noise of a world that tells her she's too much, too loud, too strong, too visible. The iron becomes her armor and her voice. In the clang of plates, she finds affirmation. These personal battles aren't recorded in history books. They're rarely captured in statues. But they are the true legacy of the gym, and in that legacy, there is hope, because shame may be universal, but so is strength. Strength to show up, to try, to fail, to rise, to be naked in a world that often demands we hide. Let's take a moment. Imagine the gym as a quiet space of transformation, where every body, imperfect, vulnerable, courageous, is worthy, where success isn't a medal or a number on a scale, but the courage to keep going. That's the ancient ideal, reborn, not in marble, not in myth, but in us, and maybe that's the real story the Greeks wanted us to carry forward. The gymnasium, at its heart, was never just a stage for muscle or a workshop for the perfect jawline. Strip away the statues and the sun-bleached sand, the stridules and the philosophical banter, and what you find is a messy, beautiful tangle of awkward humanity, naked in every sense, imperfect in every way. That is the thread that weaves from ancient Greece to right now, quietly pulsing beneath the thud of footsteps and the quiet hope of transformation. There's a temptation to believe that the ancients were made of marble, that their strength was somehow purer, more heroic, untouched by doubt. But the truth, the one never shown in statues, is that the Greek gymnasium was built as much on anxiety as on aspiration. Every flex, every sprint, every stumble across cold stone was a test, not just of the body, but of the self. The risk wasn't merely falling or failing. It was being seen, really seen, in all your striving and unfinished glory. And that's what makes it universal. Because even if you've never set foot in a Greek gym, you know the feeling. That moment of exposure, the nervousness, the hope that your efforts, awkward as they are, will add up to something. Strength, maybe, or confidence, or just a moment of belonging. Ancient Greeks lived that reality with startling They wore their vulnerability, their ambition, and their pride on their bare skin. For them, progress meant stumbling in front of everyone, day after day, and finding meaning in the mess. It was never just about the body. It was about the human condition on full, unfiltered display. Take the image of a young man, alone at dawn, stepping into a chilly courtyard. The marble under his feet is cold, the city not yet awake. He breathes in, feeling both anticipation and fear. He stretches, stumbles, and tries again. There is no applause, no record, but there is dignity, not in victory, but in the willingness to show up as himself, unarmored and imperfect. Fast forward to today. The gym is no longer a sandpit under a Mediterranean sky, but the feeling is the same. Someone, maybe you, enters a modern gym, uncertain, maybe out of place, but searching for a piece of themselves. The mirrors reflect bodies, but also insecurities and dreams. We lift, we sweat, we try. Sometimes we look foolish. Often we feel exposed. But in that exposure is the kernel of transformation. There's a kind of quiet courage in every gym, ancient or modern, that's easy to overlook. Not the bravado of the loudest lifter or the grace of the fastest runner, but the soft determination of the one who comes back, who doesn't quit, who dares to be awkward and human in a world obsessed with polish. Maybe that's what the Greeks got right and what we, in our own way, still reach for. The acceptance that progress is uncomfortable, that change is awkward, that growth, whether of muscle or mind, never looks as graceful as it feels in legend. Let's take a moment. Picture a gym at dawn. The equipment is silent, the air heavy with possibility. One person stands, alone, stretching in the half-light. No posturing, no audience, just presence. Just being this. Not perfection, but pursuit. Not heroism, but humility, is the inheritance of the ancient gymnasium. We spend so much of our lives trying to cover up our flaws, our fears, our longing to be seen and accepted. The Greeks, for all their arrogance and bravado, gave us a different story. That it's okay to be naked, awkward and unfinished. That transformation isn't about hiding, but about showing up again and again, with all your imperfections on display. And maybe, in a world that feels colder and more judgmental than ever, there's a kind of peace in remembering that the awkwardness, the nakedness, the stumbling, it's not a flaw in the story. It is the story. So if you find yourself lost, or shy, or doubting in some modern gym or crowded space, remember, you are walking an ancient path. One paved not by perfect bodies, but by vulnerable hearts and stubborn hope. Let that sink in. Breathe it in, dust and all. Because in the end, the gymnasium, ancient or modern, isn't about the strongest or the fastest or the most admired. It's about being brave enough to try to be, awkward to be seen, to be human. If you made it here, thanks. You just survived 17 chapters of cold marble, olive oil, and existential squats. Tap like, stretch your fingers toward that subscribe button, and join us again for another boring night of history. because maybe the boring stuff, that's where the real stories live.